My last part of this is the previous stuff is really just providing an analytical base for what I'm going to say now. Okay, just quickly. So this is now looking at savings and investment balances in the economy. I've divided the economy into three sectors. Well, there's the private sector, and there's the public sector, and there's foreign savings. So effectively, what we have in South Africa is a situation of permanent public dissaving, right? Financed by foreign savings. So any attempt to raise the government deficit, raise government dissaving, these three lines have to add up to zero, right? So any attempt to raise government dissaving, spend more without financing it, will either need to be financed by an inflow of foreign savings or a contraction in private investment. This is arithmetic, it's not theory, there's no causal relations here, it's just an accounting framework. So you could say the reason the government is dissaving is because growth is low. So when growth is low, revenue is low, and then government offsets the low growth by spending more. Good. But the problem is that if the key to reviving growth is private investment, that private investment will have to be backed by an inflow of foreign savings. And that inflow of foreign savings is only realistic if political and economic risk in the country is moderated, right? So that's the position we find ourselves in. Then how do you sustain this public dissaving? Essentially, there are three ways that the public sector can sustain its dissaving. The first is to issue bonds. And in the main, we issue domestic bonds. But the truth is that we have very low exposure to foreign bonds. We have very low levels of foreign-denominated debt, of dollar-denominated debt. A month or so ago, when Treasury issued a dollar-denominated bond, there was massive demand for that bond because we have easy global monetary conditions. So there's a huge space for South Africa to accumulate more debt by issuing foreign bonds, foreign-denominated bonds, right? Of course, that has a consequence. And the consequence is that we erode one of our core macroeconomic strengths. And that is that at the moment, we are invulnerable to currency fluctuation because we have low levels of foreign denominated debt. It's very difficult for us to find ourselves in a condition like Argentina. Were we to start raising foreign denominated debt, we would very quickly erode that position and find ourselves much more vulnerable to exchange rate shocks. But I'm putting it up here because given that I'm skeptical that the public sector will consolidate its debt or will consolidate its fiscal position, given that fact or given that opinion of mine, and then given the fact that we have very low exposure to foreign denominated debt, there's a temptation to rely on foreign denominated debt in order to sustain this dissaving. There's another thing we can do, and that is to run down public assets, right? So in kind of international statistical terms, and I'm not talking about legal claims, talking in statistical terms, the IMF statistical conventions, things like the GPF are a part of the public sector balance sheet. So you have an option. You can issue debt, or you can run down assets. In financial terms, one could say it's equivalent. But there are all kinds of economic reasons why it is not equivalent. For instance, when you issue debt, you incur debt service costs. When you run down assets, you don't incur debt service costs. So there's another temptation that is pressing, that can we finance this position of dissaving by running down public assets, which includes the GPF, which is controlled by the public sector, and therefore I would call a quasi-public asset. But there's a third way that you can finance dissaving by the public sector, and that is to shift liabilities and risks from financial metrics onto below the line and off budget and effectively erode the capability of the public sector. So what you're doing there is you are creating the illusion of a good fiscal policy because your debt issuance is lower on the one hand. But on the other hand, you erode the asset base of non-financial assets and capabilities in the public sector. So you're still dissaving, you're still running down your net worth in real terms, but you're not doing it through the erosion, through the accumulation of financial liabilities or the decumulation of financial assets. You're doing it by eroding the quality of public capabilities and public assets. And my suggestion is that is exactly what we have been doing, and that is most likely what we will continue to do. So I'm saying this is both directions at once, which John Coltrane said that's how he does his saxophone solo. He starts in the middle and he goes both directions at once. And I say that's great for jazz improvisation, but for fiscal policy it's not a good idea. So at the heart of the current fiscal challenge is an inconsistent policy stance. Government is maintaining a firm lid on expenditure at the top, right? So primary spending at the top, as I showed you, is kept constant as a share of GDP, maybe reduce a little, we don't know. So every year there are massive reductions in baseline allocations across the public sector. Yesterday, the Business Day had a throbbing editorial about the effect of this policy on Stats South Africa. I look forward to the same editorial about the effect on Baragwanath Hospital, because what is being experienced in Stats South Africa, what you read about yesterday in Business Day, is not confined to Stats South Africa. It is across the whole public service. Baseline cuts year after year. So what you plan to do in the MTEF, and remember we have this MTEF so that we can align planning and policy with budgets. Each year you come back and you cut that, you lower that ceiling. So hospitals, schools, police stations, all of them are facing exactly the same situation as Stats South Africa. Maybe the only difference is that they don't have a swanky new head office in Pretoria that they built recently, right? So you hold down expenditure from the top, but from below, you allow or you support various policy measures that raise the cost base. You agree to large wage escalations in centralized bargaining. And remember, from the point of view of the Gauteng Health Department, where I started, they have no influence over those wage shocks. It's decided at the center, right? So the Gauteng Health Department they're not a player in those negotiations. They simply receive the outcome of the negotiation and hope that Treasury will make good on what was agreed. So we've agreed to large wage escalations in central bargaining. We're raising the costs of public procurement in order to support localization and empowerment. We announce a new stream of uncosted policy initiatives, Sovereign Wealth Fund, Bank, Mzimvubu Dam, you name it, 1% top slicing for youth empowerment policy, right, for youth employment policy. All very good ideas, maybe, but no consideration of what's this going to do to the budget. We top slice resources for new projects. And we also go on this mantra. So the president kept emphasizing that the big problem is the misdirection of funds from consumption to capital. We must shift budgets from consumption to capital, which I think is one of the biggest misconceptions, myth in the public accounts. Because to deliver education effectively, you need capital together with textbooks, together with teachers. And it's mainly about teachers. So to put pressure under these conditions where the learner-educator is rising, and that's the fundamental metric of how the quality of your education system, is how big are your classes. The learner-educator is rising because you can't employ more teachers because you've allowed teachers' salaries to far exceed what you're prepared to make available through the budget. And then to say to people that you must shift money from consumption, which is teacher salaries, to capital, is a bit odd, especially given that the capital challenge in South Africa, the infrastructure challenge, has very little to do with the budget. It's all about the state-owned companies. That's where capital expenditure takes place and it's financed, not on the budget. So the core problem is not that fiscal policy is wrong. The core problem is that fiscal policy is not aligned with the rest of government policy. So either the rest of government policy has to change to align it with fiscal policy, or fiscal policy has to change to align it with the rest of government policy. My argument is not that any of these things are wrong. Again, you know, it's a separate debate whether teachers and nurses are overpaid or underpaid, I don't know. All I'm saying is to agree to those wage escalations and not fund it means that you are shifting the liabilities from debt. Instead of issuing debt to fund their salaries, you are eroding the capacity, the assets in schools. So departmental financial managers are left to square the circle. They can do different things because they don't have enough budget to run the policy that they are instructed to run by politics, by the political level, by the provincial cabinet, by the national cabinet. So what do? They can shift liabilities onto other spheres of government or other public agencies. They cannot pay their municipal liabilities and utility charges. They can, and then municipalities don't have their proper revenue stream, so they don't pay ESCOM or they don't pay the water board. So you have a rise in public sector financial imbalances within the public sector between one agency and another because everybody's trying to shift the problem onto the next person. You have accrued liabilities that I've mentioned to suppliers, so you don't pay, you look at it and you say, well, what am I going to do? My budget is insufficient to cover my costs for this year. Then you ask yourself, who can I not pay? Definitely I can't not pay the teachers or the doctors, but I can not pay the small business that is collecting medical waste from my hospitals. So you don't pay them. You can degrade the non-financial asset base, so cannibalize maintenance budgets, use resources that were meant for capital or research or systems improvement or workforce skills development to finance essentially salaries. And that is taking across the board. So if you have an army which has no weapons, which has no petrol to run its helicopters, which is not continuously training its personnel, which is not continuously infusing new young soldiers into the force, then you have a group of people that are called an army, but cannot perform the function of an army. And that is what you essentially have with the South African Defence Force. But that's also what you're increasingly having with the South African health system, or the police, or whatever. You have people paid salaries, but all of these complementary inputs that are necessary for them to do their work are being slowly degraded and eroded. So you're shifting risks from financial risks to non-financial asset risks. Also, you target the one part of the workforce that is not collectively bargained with, which is senior managers. So senior managers in the public service have not had a real pay increase for a decade. Their pay increases have been CPI for a decade, right? So increasingly, the public sector wage bill is compressed. This leads to, inevitably, a flight of skilled, experienced personnel from the public sector to the private sector, which also erodes public capacities. And then, of course, your last resort is to reduce headcount through attrition. Now, attrition, just allowing people to resign and not filling their posts, is often put forward as a solution, right? But remember, in a healthcare system, there are different rates of attrition. The average rate is about 6%. The rate for highly qualified medical oncologists is much higher than that. The rate for back office pen pushers is much lower. So the pen pushers, or and I'm just putting it crudely, but basically in the public sector, as probably everywhere else in the world, the people you want to retain are the first to leave because they have options, they're in demand. The people you would like to leave are going to stay there forever and they have rights. So relying on attrition to reduce the headcount in the public sector is eroding the quality of the public sector workforce.